Session on translation. We have two papers. We start with James. Just a few words of introduction. James and I are old friends, as you have already noticed. We've been both students of Michonique, so we have this background from France, from the Michoniquian side of Humboldt to a certain degree. James is professor of English now at the University of Rouen in northern France, and he is very important for Humboldt studies here in the British context, of course, because he's one of the very few scholars who have actually published a full-length monograph on Humboldt. So that was in 2009 with Edinburgh University Press called Humboldt, Language and Worldview. James has, building on that, in certain ways also published a book on the metaphor, and also a book now on ethnolinguistics, and he has set up a network in Rouen, which is called the REP, the Rouen Ethnolinguistics Project. That works very much with the School of Lublin in Poland, and also connections to the Czech Republic and various scholars within Europe. And I'm delighted that you are with us, James. And,
Thank you, Marco.
Yeah, looking forward to your paper. And then we do it again as in the formal sessions, that afterwards we have a second paper and we discuss both papers together then.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I've already spoken and already thanked Marco for this great opportunity to get together. It's rare and it's hard, and we've seen with John's paper how hard it is to speak about Humboldt. So there's a certain achievement in getting us here, and I think that's part of a greater small wave or small ripple of Humboldt's ripple of interest in Humboldt that may produce future dialogues. At least I hope that will be the case. But I'm not as pessimistic as the note we ended on with Jürgen's paper. We started with our optimism, and I know his optimism, but I'm still sort of skeptical about the reception, and I think John gave us a lot of reasons to be skeptical about the possibilities of getting Humboldt understood. So I've called it Pearls of Wisdom or Splashes in the Ocean. That's what I've called it, because I'm trying to fit in here. As a good friend, Marco gave me my slot, and he says, you can do translation studies. Okay. His influence on translation studies? There is an influence on translation studies? This was my question. So I'm trying to fit in, but I'm fitting in the same way that John has fitted in. By saying how has he been received or misconceived or perceived, and what is it that keeps attracting people back to Humboldt? Because John had a very nice expression this morning. It was ghost. He haunts debates. His name keeps coming up. So, Pearls of Wisdom or Splashes in the Ocean. First thing that we've already spoken about, he's a noble guy, so a noble thinker that we've already seen this picture. But is this the person we're speaking about? Or is it the Humboldt brothers that we've insisted again and again, that he's not one brother, but he's part of the brothers? He's a dialogue from the beginning. The brother relationship is fundamental. Jürgen's written on this many times, but the Geyer biography faithfully represents this. The German tradition perpetuates this idea of the brothers. And his brothers, but the brothers are the friends of Goethe and Schiller, which explains the whole relationship with creativity that we've already spoken about. They're together in dialogue, but more than dialogue, which is fashionable, but which means exchange, it's conversation. Conversation, so multiple sort of dialogues. This is the Humboldt we're interested in. So as Jürgen says, and as we said before, it's not him, it's the other one, because people do constantly come up to you and speak to you about Alexander at the end of things, which shows an interest for the brothers. This is interesting. There's an interest for the brothers, but we kept getting at the wrong brother, but these brothers are inseparable to a certain extent. So not him. He's a great thinker, the political thinker, the inventor of the university, the linguist. I did stress that England does understand Humboldt, and even better than Germany at one stage on liberty. on liberty begins with this quotation from Humboldt, and again and again the energy behind On Liberty, the freedom and creativity and being individuals in society in John Stuart Mill's work is a Humboldtian work. He declares this very clearly. I'm not going to be speaking about this, but it is fundamental. Political thinker then, inventor of the university. This is important because we are creatures of the university. The university is what we do, is what we create, what we perpetuate, and this is important. That's why the fact that he does linguistics in the university is important for us in politics, in political terms. That's why I think it is what Marco is doing is politically important. What do Humboldt's writings have to tell us about language, translation, worldview? These are my questions. I'll focus more on translation today. Now, I'd say that, to start my paper, what does Wilhelm von Humboldt have to say about translating? How have his ideas shaped translation studies? Have they shaped translation studies? How have they influenced them? Exactly 200 years after his first publication, Humboldt's preface to his translation of the Aeschylus Agamemnon still speaks to key authors, from George Steiner to Henri Mechanique, to Antoine Berman, who has had great impact on Venuti and present-day translation studies. Humboldt's insights do have some kind of insight into the adventure of translating. And this translation, this act of translating that forces us to do something, to face up to something fundamental about creative expression and our relation to other cultures. Now this has been filtered through Schleiermacher and has moved into Steiner's work on translation studies. And very much, not focus on, but I'd like to look at the superficial influence in Mona Baker and Lawrence Venuti 200 years on. Surprising though, because in the end, Humboldt has written so little on translation studies, just a little preface. So we can be surprised in this, but surprised that people like Barbara Cassin, Barbara Cassin, who's just published the Dictionary of Untranslatables, will declare that this is a Humboldtian work. Well, there is a French tradition. There's a French tradition leading from Henri Mechanique in 1970, who's writing on Humboldt, is a Humboldtian, to Barbara Cassin, who's writing the 2004 Dictionary of Untranslatables, published once more in English version, translated into various languages in 2014. So there is an impact. There's a very real interest, and there is a sort of impact of Humboldt on the French tradition. What's his impact on translation studies? Well, translation studies is not a universal discipline, of course. It varies from culture to culture, but even so, I would say in a vast number of contexts, in a vast number of languages or language cultures, people are coming together, theoreticians are coming together, and they've converged mainly in English to investigate the poetics and the ethics, and the politics of translating. Now, no compilations are perfect. No anthologies don't leave things out. But two key texts published by Routledge deserve mention, I believe, because they both reflect the contemporary currents that are making waves in translation studies. And because they have in turn affected the way the discipline of translation studies is perceived, conceived, and the way it's taught on campuses throughout America, throughout Britain, but also to a certain extent throughout the world, in North America. They're also worth mentioning here today because they both find a place for Humboldt. Now, I'm thinking of Lawrence Venuti's third edition to the Translation Studies Reader. Published in London and New York in 2012, Venuti he brings together and embraces a large and generous range of studies, a generous range of approaches. And his reader it's a very English-speaking reader in a very healthy way because it's absorbing criticism and transforming itself as it goes along. It's reactive. From our perspective, it's important. Venuti is important because he quotes Humboldt and his project, and he understands something fundamental. The word has already been introduced, das Fremde, okay, the foreign. It's come up again and again in our discussions, and he understands something about this. So, to a large extent, Venuti, although I'll make criticisms, Venuti is on our side to a certain extent. He understands something of Humboldt's concept of das Fremde, the foreign. Now, it's true he wants to integrate that foreign into his own poetics, but he understands something about it, and he celebrates something in Humboldt. So something is celebrated in Humboldt, in this étrangeté, or this strangeness that's celebrated. How does he celebrate it, though? Venuti will celebrate this Fremde as a revolt against tradition. A revolt against tradition means what? It means in contemporary or 1990s, when he first writes his translation, his Invisibility of the Translator in 1995, it's very much a revolt against tradition, and it's an attack on the established canon. That places him in a postmodernist aesthetics, with a long romantic, post-romantic, modernist, and then postmodernist tradition. We might question whether this bears something in relationship to Humboldt's poetics. I would argue that Humboldt did not see poets as outsiders and rebels, because Venuti is going to be principally interested very much in the Poundian tradition in poetry and how poetry can transform tradition. This is very close to actually what Marco is doing with this transformative aspect of Humboldt. It's very close also to Mechanique, who believes in poetry as a means of transforming society. And I have a great deal of sympathy for this as well. But let's see how Humboldt sees things. Humboldt did not see poets as outsiders or rebels. He's not a romantic or a post-romantic. He has too much respect for tradition and for language. He respects language, but what does that mean? Well, Humboldt was a friend of Schiller and Goethe, and like them, he saw culture in organic terms. But he sees the writer as part of that organic transformation. And language is creativity. Creativity is not going to come outside and attack on language, which is reducing language to structure, to convention, to norms, and impersonal norms, unhuman norms. He doesn't see a human influence coming from outside and attacking that. The artist for Humboldt is part of culture and language. He holds that, and he will come back to this question of individuality and individuals and how we become individuals. Well, closer to Vygotsky than to Piaget, Humboldt sees language as the source of creativity and individuality. That's why our 2010 lectures were, when we came together with John and with Jürgen, they were important because they put the individual at the center of language. How? Well, Humboldt holds that individuals cultivate themselves within culture. Conversely, the culture of the community is constantly being creatively regenerated by speakers and artists who are speaking and expressing themselves and writing and thinking together. So Venuti might be opposed to Humboldt in Humboldt's way of seeing culture to a certain extent. He would certainly be forced, if he took this part of Humboldt, to put Humboldt into a conservative or conformist tradition almost. I think that would be a misreading, but this would be a Venuti reading. Venuti, however, does grasp that the Humboldtian idea of what he calls and what Venuti celebrates, he's become famous for this opposition, what he celebrates as foreignizing translation. He celebrates foreignizing translation as an opposition to ethnocentric translation, which he calls domesticating translation. And how he perceives, and Venuti does quote Humboldt, he reads and quotes Humboldt, and he quotes him for being an antidote. He says, this foreignizing translation can be enlisted as a nationalist practice that can build a German language and literature, and overcome the cultural and political domination that France exercised over the German-speaking lands. Forward, I think. I'm going a bit too far here. Okay, so like Venuti's reader-friendly anthology, Mona Baker here, Baker and Saldana, have put together an encyclopedia of translation studies. This was first published in 1998, second edition in 2009, and it's published in New York with a paperback edition in 2011. It's really central to the discipline. And it gives a fairly, on the whole, I must say, as a teacher of translation studies, it gives a very reasonable and reliable, fairly reliable impression of a very effervescent dynamism that is happening. Translation studies is a discipline that's happening, things are happening and things are going on there. And they give a sort of wide overview of this. Like Venuti, Mona Baker and Saldana remind us that Humboldt still counts today. He's the defender of a certain way of approaching translation. Is this fair? Are they right? Is what they say legitimate? Well, I believe that they have perceived something in Humboldt about the idea that Humboldt understands that in languages we create worlds, and it's individuals that create worlds, and they create it creatively. And that translation is part of that. Creation, translation, individuality. I believe they've understood that, and I believe that translators are among the most sensitive people that are likely to perceive the importance of Humboldt, because they know that the translator must move from one world to another world, and that involves the language system, rules, but also personal choices. So I believe they have understood something about this. They understand that translators build bridges, they fill gaps, they find gaps, and they transform things. What is less encouraging then is that neither Baker nor Saldana quote Humboldt at all, at any point in there, although they talk about the Humboldtian tradition. And this has become a fairly routine way that Humboldt has been treated in scholarly works. Baldana and Saldana are really joining a tradition that moves within a strategy of paying lip service to the Humboldtian tradition, which brings in a whole lot of people that John's treated this morning. The only people I'd add would be Delheims and the ethnopoetics, which I think is a very strong tradition. This is a strong linguistic anthropology with people on the ground working with linguistic diversity, who are sensitive to stories, to poetry, to creativity. These do form part of a legitimate tradition, and people like Saldana, Baker and Saldana will place Humboldt within this tradition of Boas, Sapir, leading up to what they will talk in terms of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Schleiermacher, though, is going to be the central figure in this. For Baker and Saldana in 2009, Humboldt fits snugly between Herder and Schleiermacher. Herder, born in 1744, who dies in 1803, and Schleiermacher, who's really very much a contemporary of Humboldt, almost exactly. He's born a year after in 1768 and dies in 1834, a year before, born a year after, dies a year before. The problem for me is that Marcos asked me to do the influence of Humboldt, and every time I read Humboldt and Humboldtian tradition, I get Schleiermacher. Let's see how this works. Schleiermacher and Humboldt steals the limelight. Lefebvre, the Canadian, is the source quoted by Baker and Saldana. They refer to. And Lefebvre leans towards a hermeneutics of translation, as did George Steiner. I'm not going to do credit to George Steiner because I can't go through each of the writers, but George Steiner really comes down to hermeneutics of translation, although he's a sensitive reader to Humboldt. George Steiner, in his After Babel Aspects of Language and Translation, first published in 1975, is ultimately interested in the Humboldt, the later Humboldt, the Humboldt after the preface on translation studies. He's not so much, he's more interested in worldviews, the aspects that Jürgen spoke about this morning, than the actual issues of translating and translation texts, which is curious. And it's actually similar to Mechanik, who quotes the later Humboldt, but not the Humboldt on translation studies. This rapprochement, then, between Schleiermacher and Humboldt, is it legitimate? Yes. Denis Touard, who's a specialist of both, who knows equally well, is equally well versed in both authors, stressed their commonalities when he argued that they both seem to follow the same line of thought. Indeed, both authors do what? They envisage the entry of the foreign into the target culture. However, Touard is a very close reader, a very subtle close reader, and he stresses the incommensurable difference between the two authors. On the one hand, you have Humboldt, who sees theorizing translation as a step towards a step on the way to developing Humboldt's own theory of language. So translation is already there. Translation will always be a challenge to people in linguistics because it introduces different questions. But here it's already been established from the beginning. This is because Humboldt is a writer and he's a translator himself. So it's modeled, it's conditioned his way of perceiving language. So Humboldt sees translation as one step in the way of developing a theory of language and one step in the way of celebrating something. Celebrating what? Celebrating the poetic individuality of each language and the diversity of manners by which communities invent worlds. We know about this, we've spoken about this already this morning a lot. Schleiermacher? Schleiermacher, on the other hand, is very much a hermeneutician. And as Touard rightly argues, Schleiermacher is primarily interested in what? He's primarily interested in the cognitive implications of comprehension. Humboldt breaks with Herder's religious conception of the origin of language, but as a Protestant minister, Schleiermacher is inevitably concerned with the interpretation of translation of the Holy Word. So we're in a different kind of text with a different kind of ethics. And what's very interesting for the Venuti's reception of Schleiermacher is there's the verschiedene Methoden, the various methods, become one strategy. Because Venuti is only interested in this one part. He's not interested in the different kinds of texts with different kinds of policies for translation, which is a reasonable approach. And I think most translators would perceive that as an operational method, but it's also one that's closer to Skopos theory than to Humboldt, so I'm not sure whether we can talk about a Humboldtian influence there. Schleiermacher is inevitably concerned with this holy word and with a very different kind of ethics of translation, a very different conception of language. As a philosopher, he must take into account the diversity of languages. This is what we spoke about before. What do we do with this diversity? Well, it exists, we perceive it, we understand it, but this is more of a problem than wonderful riches of the world, which is the Humboldtian perspective. Diversity is what? It's a tough problem rather than an exciting or enticing invitation. Now, a rigorous parallel reading of the two main texts of Friedrich Schleiermacher's on the different methods of translating in 1813 and Humboldt's preface to the Agamemnon would be very revealing. Certainly worth doing, but for the purposes of today's paper, I must focus on Humboldt's contribution to the way translation can be conceptualized, and I must be asking, what status should we accord to Humboldt's ideas and his conception of language? Now, in terms of Schleiermacher, I would just sort of stress that this dense and thought-provoking article by Schleiermacher has continues to fascinate all of my colleagues and my younger colleagues. It continues, it's a short essay, but it continues to fascinate people. But Schleiermacher, in my experience, has tended to be read very selectively. Not really following this. He tends to be read very selectively. Schleiermacher has been held up as a champion of the foreign and a disturbing influence. This is Venuti's reading. Venuti's reading is this disturbing influence when he promotes the foreignizing strategy in contrast to this ethnocentric domesticating strategy. So we've got verschiedene Methoden, we've got various methods which are reduced to one method, and this one method is adapted into a sort of postmodernist poetics. Humboldt will be tagged onto this reading, but he'll be part of this Humboldtian tradition, supposed Humboldtian tradition. For other readers, more often than not, Schleiermacher remains the apostle of hermeneutics, a theory of translation as interpretation. And then we get down to this constant metaphor, because we have specialists of metaphor in the room, of extracting the meaning or importing the meaning. We're in this, which is very much not I would argue, not a Humboldtian conception of language, this hermeneutics. This is how Steiner reads Schleiermacher. This is how Venuti reads Schleiermacher. And this hermeneutics seems to be what really is animating this celebration or this appropriation. Appropriation was the word I think that David used before. This seems to be really what's behind this, as far as I can understand. I would say Steiner's and Venuti's interpretations then demonstrate interpretations or appropriations, or Steiner does credit to Humboldt much more in about 5 or to 10 pages in After Babel, but it doesn't really transform his way of thinking about translating. Though many authors are manifestly sympathetic to the idea they have formed of Wilhelm von Humboldt, and the sympathy is again and again brought out, it seems to be a kind of lip service or an enthusiasm about what? An enthusiasm about their own conception of what they have decided to use Humboldt to support. It's like God, and let's not confuse God with Humboldt or Humboldt with God, but people create God in their own image, and people create Humboldt in their own image and then celebrate him as a means to celebrating their own personal project. Very rarely do people read in detail a Steiner and Michnik. I won't do Michnik justice today. This is Marco's work that I give to him for the future. But I would say simply that we've got this lack of reading, that if we read Humboldt as Steiner reads him today, then we would have very different discussions today. More worryingly still is that Humboldt is invariably read out of context, or he's miscontextualized. He's placed within the Romantic tradition, though he's the intimate friend of Goethe and Schiller and Goethe are part of the literary movement of the Sturm und Drang, which is a pre-Romantic movement, the Storm and Stress tradition, which preceded the Romantics. And Humboldt is very much a man of the 18th century. And I would argue, even though there's been a lot of critiques of the Enlightenment, and Humboldt was perhaps part of that to a certain extent, he remains very much with one foot in the Enlightenment. And he's closer to Leibniz and to Kant in many, many ways than he is to Schlegel, his contemporaries. The Schlegel brothers, his contemporaries, and the people he influenced, the next generation of Bob, the great Indo-European scholar that we spoke about this morning with Ute's paper. More worrying still, Humboldt is conflated with Derrida. I'm not even going to get into this, but I mean, really, to put Derrida and Humboldt together is a very curious equation that needs to be sorted out, I think. Now, this is Venuti's then. This is the really sort of pretty much the dominant paradigm for people interested in our questions of poetics and the poetics of translation. Foreignizing translation in English can be a form of resistance against ethnocentrism and racism, cultural narcissism and imperialism in the interest of democratic geopolitical relations. And I think many of us would agree with many of the fundamental sentiments that are behind that. But is this a Humboldtian reading? What about reading Humboldt? And that's what I propose to do in the second part of the paper. I would have 9 things to say about the what Humboldt says about translation. Some of it has become very straightforward because we've moved on with translation studies. Some of it's really quite perplexing. So let's have a look at the 9 things that we have to speak about. The first thing then I would say that is that no word in any one language can be considered an exact equivalent to another. The word has its own individual nature with its own specific character and specific shape. I'm quoting Humboldt. Its specific character and specific shape with its own power to affect the spirit. So words are not means to convey ideas that are already somewhere elsewhere. They influence the sentiment and the way we organize our ideas. Ein individuelles Wesen von bestimmtem Charakter und bestimmten Gestalt, von einer auf das Gemüt wirkenden Kraft. This Gemüt wirkenden Kraft is really fundamental. It's working back with energy and force and power. This power of language is working back on the spirit. This idea is developed in terms of language system. And what are language systems? Well, he says, and this is a very perplexing word because we can't translate it, he says they are not synonymien, which is translated automatically into synonymic in the one translation of the 4 or 5 pages that we have of this. We don't have much of this translation of the preface, okay, the Achilles preface, but synonymic because we just still feel so uncomfortable about using this because we've given a very strict definition of synonyms since then. But he says, what does he mean here? He means that each language expresses a concept somewhat differently. Nuances are arranged differently on the ladder of perceptions. We know this. We know this as linguists, but on the whole, people tend to forget this and say, how do you translate? As though we can translate. He knows this is the problem. Now, Barbara Cassin knows this is the problem, and this is the level she remains at. This lexical level. There'll be 3 levels, and Jürgen Traban has spoken about this again and again. 3 levels of understanding the differences between languages. Are they simply different systems with different labels? No, we know there are different concepts, and the different concepts are arranged culturally. This is the lexical level. No longer word lists, but lists of difficult concepts to translate. The second level, the grammatical level. Languages have different grammatical systems, and those grammatical systems influence the way we organize ideas. Men, women, animate, inanimate. Do we put liquids together? Do we put sky together? How do we organize up and above? So is it grammatical? Third level, worldviews. Languages as different worldviews. Barbara Cassin doesn't go on to this. She won't really go on to the second level of grammar, and she won't really go on to the level of worldviews, but she'll bounce between the lexis and the worldview. Now, words cannot be reduced to signs is the second point. This is a critique of the sign. There's a critique of the sign. Words cannot be reduced to signs. This is the major challenge to the hermeneutic approach. Words do not designate objects. And here we've criticized Locke this morning, but Humboldt is very Lockean in this question. He says that, as Locke knew, words refer to objects of understanding. Objects of understanding. Words refer to categories that we hold in our mind. The word Mandarin doesn't exist in every language. Mandarin, Satsuma, Clementine, Orange. We just organize these. Time. I've got to go very quickly. Okay then. Languages. Okay then. We know that we have different words and we organize them differently. Languages are made up of words, but not words alone. This is once more a challenge to the hermeneutic approach. Humboldt holds that words do not exist in and of themselves. They exist in a complex form of euphony. Now, what does he mean by euphony? Although he's not yet using this word, he doesn't use it in 1816 in the preface, he used it later in 1836, but already the image is already there. This image of, here we have this idea that the musical image is already clearly in play here as the undertones of language that slumber as the sounds of unplayed instrument. Allein diese Töne schlummern wie ein ungespieltes Instrument. This idea of a whole, an orchestrated whole. Language is an orchestrated whole. It's the patterning, okay, this is the essential point for translation studies. It's the patterning of the links between words that allows us to grasp them and make sense of the limited number of sounds we have at our disposal for inventing our ideas and carving our conception. Fourth point. Okay. Fourth point. This process of shaping words is a reciprocal one. Marco will speak about this later. It happens between us. We can express ourselves because we share with others. We share with others in our linguistic community the ability to grasp words and the complex links that give them their place in language. Words are like notes in a melody. We're coming back to this melody metaphor that he's thinking with. The energy of the mind is not the solitary effort, we've spoken about this before, of individuals struggling to express themselves. They express themselves together. They learn to express themselves together. And that expression helps the community express itself. For Humboldt, individuals become individuals through language and through interaction. 5. Contrary to arguments generated from contemporary interpretations of Schleiermacher, Humboldt is very much against word-for-word translations. He doesn't believe this is fidelity. Fidelity to the word is not fidelity to the translation. Moreover, he does not hold that the word to be the relevant unit of translation. In fact, he asserts that it is in striving to preserve the identity and the uniformity of the original text that leads to a transgression of a greater order, as the translator will deviate from the original by being pedantically attached to individual words, slavish word-for-word translations, which is basically the poetics that's been celebrated from the Schleiermacher tradition in the last 20 years. 6 then, translation may be impossible, and he does actually say it may be impossible. But what does he mean? It's impossible if it's conceived as reproducing the same effects in the same culture, which would not be translation. This would be doing the text at the same time, in the same language. But it's crucial as a cultural encounter. Crucial as a cultural encounter because of its profound influence. Because a language can enrich a culture. Now there are two sides to this, and I'm really going to take even if it takes a couple of minutes more, I really want to stress these two sides because they're mistaken. The two sides of this are that translations, and above all poetic translations, enrich us, I quote, partly because they direct those who do not know other languages to forms of art and human experience that would otherwise have remained totally unknown to them. But above all, not only this, but above all, because they increase the depth and meaning of one's own language. The expressive potential of the language is enriched by this. Now, the seventh question, and I'll get to the 9 very, very quickly. Okay, the 7th question, the translator must be animated by a sentiment of humility. This is standard translation ethics. By a sincere, but he means by this a sincere affinity for the original. But this is very different from the slavish adherence to words of their language. We don't translate the language, we don't translate the word, we translate the text, and we translate this text as a work that we have entered into with a humility in face of its greatness. He's thinking of great texts, Greek texts. Humboldt stresses that every good translation should grow out of a simple and modest love of an original, and that love means what? Love means a love of the parts and how the parts hold together in a meaningful and beautiful whole. This is very important actually for Venuti, because Venuti is going to be against the harmony of the whole. The harmony is going to be an important question for him. Like Schleiermacher, then my 8th question, there should be a foreign flavour. And they're really, in many, many respects, and in this respect very much, Schleiermacher and Humboldt are very much converging on this. Humboldt suggests that some text should retain a foreign flavour. What does he mean by foreign flavour? He means that something which is not simply irksomely different and doesn't read like a translation, but something which dynamically changes and allows the foreign to change things in an interesting way. We can come back to that question later, but he's very much against what he calls Undeutschheit und Dunkelheit. Undeutschheit, it's not German, and it's not clear, because the obscurity gets in the way of the harmonious expression of the great, strong, simple, beautiful text that he's interested in saving. This is very different from the Venuti's poetics. Last one, that's harmony. Harmony and order are organizing principles in both language and in aesthetics for Humboldt. This harmony and this organization. The subtitle of Agamemnon is not neutral, and there's a whole theory. Troyes goes through this, he theorizes this. There's a whole period where is it going to be metrical or not? It is metrisch übersetzt. And this puts him on the side of Dryden. This simplicity, but grace and simplicity, which he sees as being part of the work he's translating. This is very close to Dryden, the Dryden tradition, which is great style, fluid, graceful, metrical, rhymed, but not forced into meter and rhyme. Gentle but organic use of meter and rhythm. So in this sense, it's very much the antithesis of Venuti, who wants a disruptive poetics and who has the aesthetics of his period, which is free verse aesthetics, but free verse is a rejection of. This is an ethics of free verse, but not a praxis of free verse. Free verse has existed alongside metrical verse throughout the 20th century, but Venuti is not there. Venuti is celebrating a very standard idea of freedom on the side of rupture and transgression. So in closing then, I would say that in closing, I would say that there is very much a difficult reception, in very much the same way that I think John's paper went in this direction. There's a difficult reception. There's a whole series of aesthetic, poetic, and political reasons that is difficult to understand. The question we have to ask is, who is Humboldt? Is he a friend of the Enlightenment? Is he a friend of culture? Are we friends of culture? Are we friends of the Enlightenment? Is the Fremde really a defense of alterity? Or is it used as an attack on ethnocentrism? How can that be anything else but an attack on colonialism in a post-colonial culture? So he's being filtered through this. I would move back then to philology in a Humboldtian sense. A philology is a celebration of alterity perhaps, but more as a poetic approach to which we'll find in Meschenich, which found in Berman, which we'll find in Steiner. This is where the real Humboldtians, I think, will be found in translation culture. It's also an intellectual adventure for Trabant, I think, for Jürgen Trabant, for Barbara Cassin, for Denis Touard. In the Anglo tradition that John spoke about this morning, I think we find much more instrumentalization of Humboldt and his tradition, the Humboldtian tradition, I'm finished, to fight culture-specific battles. Okay, thank you for your tolerance. Sorry.